Okay, as we said in the last video, welcome to the New Deal. I gave you that expert alliteration, the 3 R's of the New Deal. Relief, recovery, reform. The whole idea of what's going on in the country is this is something that's completely taken everybody by surprise. A number of things have collided together, and at the just time, most people would refer to it as the perfect storm, as a perfect economic storm. And so as we move forward, as Roosevelt moves forward, he's got to, his primary task is to find ways to alleviate fear. Fortunately, Roosevelt has the press working with him in this avenue to alleviate fear instead of stirring up people's fears and panic. So, Roosevelt is going to try to choose loyal people that he can trust to be part of his cabinet. He doesn't want people to be rivals. If he were to have rivals, then at some point in his presidency, he would wind up having conflicts and problems. Well, case in point is when he selects Joseph Kennedy to be the chairman of the Security and Exchange Commission. Eventually, Joe becomes a critic of some of these New Deal programs, and so FDR is going to send Joe Kennedy to London to be the American ambassador to England. There's a really nice book called 1,000 Days in London, which deals with Joe Kennedy's tenure and his son Joe Jr. and John and Bobby Kennedy as they spend time in England while Joe was ambassador. Joe Kennedy had was planning to run against Roosevelt for president when World War II, when Germany invaded into Czechoslovakia and into Poland. It dashed those hopes because Roosevelt had sort of been a supporter of the Munich Accord, which we'll talk about later. But Roosevelt needs people who aren't going to become rivals, people who aren't going to rock the boat, people who are going to work with him so that we can alleviate the problems created by this depression. For Secretary of State, he chooses Cordell Hull. Cordell Hull is an old Wilsonian Southerner, a big advocate of free trade, right? And then for the Treasury, Will Wooden. Wooden is a Republican, but he's eager to try new experiments in maintaining and controlling the economy and economic ideals. Roosevelt doesn't care what party you're from. What Roosevelt wants is people who are willing to work together with new ideas. Roosevelt didn't want to just take over major sections of the economy. He wanted people to come up with new ideas and the federal government to provide sort of safety nets. Okay? These two men are going to appeal to the business and industry areas because these are two men that basically come from their backgrounds and they trust them. They still need to rescue the economy though, which we'll talk about just shortly. Some areas he needs true reformers. In labor and agriculture, he is going to put Frances Perkins, the first woman Secretary of State. If I'm not mistaken, she's also the first female cabinet member at all. Most of the labor leaders were really, really angry when Frances Perkins is appointed the Secretary of Labor. But they come around when Frances Perkins demonstrates that she's the best person for the job. Secretary of Agriculture, Roosevelt is going to select a person who's already well known within this community, Henry Wallace, who's already spearheading avenues towards making agriculture, scientific methods in agriculture and farming, government regulation of markets and things like that. The rest of his cabinets, all sections of the country are represented, both major parties, 3 major religions, men and women will serve in Roosevelt's cabinet. Roosevelt doesn't care what your previous politics were. If you are willing to work together and you have new ideas and you're not going to become a rival, you're welcome to join in the discussion. He meets more than 30 times in the first 100 days. 30 times in the first 100 days. And then once a week, he meets with the press after this. Okay? He would talk to people. He would talk to people constantly. One of his biographers puts him this way. His wide grin and infectious optimism made him the personal symbol of recovery, the emblem of hope for millions. Okay? Now, we're beginning to talk about banking reform. This is one of the places where you can see this notion of the New Deal having all three areas: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, recovery, and reform. Okay? By the time Roosevelt takes office, almost all the banks in the country are closed. They're shut down. The state governors did it. As people get worried about about their money and their savings, and they have what we refer to as a run on the bank, everybody takes their money out of the banks. Well, the way banks make money is they make loans to people. The people who borrow the money pay the money back with interest, and the way that the banks get the money is you put them in your savings account. So when the people start running on the banks, taking all their money out of the state-controlled banks, the governors, in sort of a knee-jerk and reactionary method, they shut down all the banks and won't let people have their money. Won't let people have their money. The biggest thing this did was cause more panic. It just caused more panic. Since 1930, more than 5,000 banks are destroyed. They're gone. $3.4 billion. And this is 1930s money. $3.4 billion just gone up in smoke. It's just evaporated. On the 4th, on his inauguration day, right after he tells us we have nothing to fear but fear itself, he tells us what is necessary is action now. We must take action now. So he declares that on the 6th of March, we'll begin a 4-day bank holiday. It's a federal policy. Now, basically, the banks are going to close for 4 days. But isn't that what the governors did? They just closed the banks? Well, this is the difference. Remember earlier I said that sometimes it's not what you say, but it's how you say it? Listen to what Roosevelt said. A 4-day bank holiday. Do you like holidays? Everybody likes holidays. How would you like to take a 4-day weekend this year? Would you like a 4-day weekend? 4-day weekends are nice. And a holiday, that's nice too. Basically, the difference between what Roosevelt did and the state governors did was that he established a time limit. And he basically said, let's take a step back and spend 4 days so we can take a look at the banks, and at the end of the 4 days, we're going to open the banks back up. That's what his message was. It doesn't seem knee-jerk and reactionary. It doesn't seem like it's a panic-driven move to protect the banks from going under. It sounds, at least, like Roosevelt's got a plan. And he does. Because the thing of it is, he does this on a Thursday, and so now the 4-day bank holiday becomes a 6-day bank holiday. The banks won't be open until the following week. On the 9th of March, the Emergency Banking Act goes to Congress. It's amazing how long it takes for bills to go from one house to the Senate and then back to the House until they can both vote on it and then go to the White House for a signature. But the Emergency Banking Act, which came from the White House to the Congress on the 9th of March, passes in just 4 hours. It goes from one house, 4 hours, to the other house, to the White House in 4 hours. The whole thing is accomplished in a very short time period. Here's what it does. The Emergency Banking Act allows the Secretary of the Treasury, while the banks are closed, to decide which banks are strong enough to reopen. And at the end of the bank holiday, the banks that are strong enough to reopen will reopen. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, which was actually a corporation that was created by Hoover at the beginning of the Depression to give loans to corporations. The RFC is going to be used as a conduit from the Federal Reserve to all of the smaller banks. The smaller banks, which proved not to be solvent at the time when the Treasury Secretary looks at them, is going to receive an infusion of capital from the Federal Reserve to bring it up to solvency, so that when they finally reach solvency, those banks will open also. He creates something called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Most banks will talk about the fact that your deposits are insured. What this says is that regardless of what kind of mistakes the banks make, or regardless of what happens in the bank, the money you deposit in the bank is federally insured. You will not lose your savings. You will not lose your savings. The radicals were disappointed because he did not nationalize the banking system. But that wasn't what he wanted to do. He did not have a desire to nationalize the banking system. Right? He also did one other thing, which is not really mentioned here at this point. At this point, what we had was a single banking institution that did 3 kinds of banking. It did personal banking, it did business banking, it also did investment banking. Much of what happened in the stock market collapse was a result of these banks using bank funds to make loans for people to purchase stocks on margin, which basically means purchasing stocks on credit. When the stock market collapsed, all of those loans for enormous quantities of stocks were worthless. They had lost all of their value. And so what's going to happen is all of the money that was tied up in those loans have now evaporated. I owe the bank $10,000 for my stock, which I bought 100 shares of IBM. When the stock market collapses, my $10,000 worth of IBM is only worth $100. When the bank comes to collect my $10,000, I tell them I don't have it, and they say, we'll have to take your collateral. The bank allowed these shareholders to use their stock as their collateral. And I say, fine, here's my 100 shares of IBM, which is now worth $100. And so all of the money that was loaned evaporates. It's gone. One thing that happens with this Emergency Banking Act, it takes personal banking and business banking and separates it completely from investment banking. It's kind of easy to see in Chase Manhattan Bank. You can open a personal savings and a business account at Chase Manhattan Bank. But if you want to do investment banking through Chase Manhattan, you have to do your investment banking in J.P. Morgan Investments. So, even though this activity is, some people say, had no effect, the thing of it is, the banks remain open throughout the rest of the Great Depression. They never close again. They never close again. And some people would say that FDR didn't do anything in reality, and they will be naysayers and all that. But the simple fact that the banks never close again means that, if nothing else, FDR did restore confidence in the American economy.